When Haven Jackson collapsed behind the concrete barrier, blood pooling beneath her torn uniform, everyone assumed she was finished. 5 bullets had found their mark, and any reasonable person would have called for a medic and waited for evacuation. Instead, Haven reached for her radio with trembling hands and said the words that would echo through military history. Grid reference 847392. Fire for effect. For the next 4 hours, as enemy forces pressed their assault, she would direct artillery strikes with surgical precision while her life slowly drained away. This is the story of how the communications specialist they never trusted with real operations became the woman who saved an entire battalion. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Forward Operating Base Meridian as Haven Jackson completed her 3rd equipment check of the day. At 23, she moved through the communications bay with methodical precision, her slight frame barely reaching the shoulders of the towering radio arrays that dominated the cramped space. The base hummed with its familiar rhythm, diesel generators providing steady power, the distant rumble of supply trucks, and the constant chatter of radio traffic that served as the nerve system for the entire operation. Haven had been stationed at Meridian for 11 months, and every single day had followed the same pattern. While her fellow soldiers prepared for patrol missions, reconnaissance operations, and direct action raids, she remained anchored to her desk, managing communications traffic and maintaining equipment that others deemed too complex for field operations. Her official title was Communications Specialist, but everyone simply called her Radio Girl, a designation that carried both affection and dismissal in equal measure. The irony wasn't lost on her. Haven possessed the highest technical scores in her training class and could operate every piece of communications equipment in the military inventory. She'd memorized radio protocols, encryption procedures, and emergency frequencies that most soldiers never bothered to learn. Her attention to detail was legendary among the technical staff, but when it came to field operations, she might as well have been invisible. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Steele, the base commander, valued her technical expertise but couldn't see past her physical limitations. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing less than 130 pounds, Haven didn't fit the image of a soldier who could handle the physical demands of combat operations. Her quiet demeanor and tendency to solve problems through careful analysis rather than aggressive action reinforced the perception that she belonged behind a desk, not in the field. The morning briefing was already underway when Haven slipped into the back of the command tent. Maps covered every available surface, showing the complex terrain of the Balkan Rally where their unit had been conducting operations for the past 6 months. Red markers indicated known enemy positions, while blue lines traced patrol routes and supply corridors. She found her usual spot near the communications equipment, notepad ready to document any changes to radio procedures or frequency assignments. Today's patrol mission is designated Eagle 7, Lieutenant Colonel Steele announced to the assembled soldiers. We've received intelligence about increased enemy activity in sectors 4 and 5. Alpha Company will conduct a sweep of the northern ridgeline, while Bravo Company secures the supply route. Haven's pen moved across her notepad, documenting call signs and frequency assignments, though she already knew she wouldn't be included in the mission itself. As Steele continued the briefing, detailing terrain challenges and potential threats, Haven found herself studying the topographical maps with growing concern. The planned route took the patrol through a narrow valley that offered multiple ambush positions and limited escape routes. More troubling, the designated radio checkpoint locations were positioned in areas with known communication dead zones, places where the mountains would block radio signals and leave the patrol isolated from artillery support. She discovered these dead zones during months of careful signal analysis, mapping radio coverage across the entire operational area using data that others ignored. Her personal project involved correlating terrain features with signal strength, weather patterns with communication reliability, and equipment performance with environmental conditions. It was work that no one had assigned her, knowledge that no one had requested, but Haven understood that information could mean the difference between life and death. When the briefing concluded, soldiers filed out to prepare their equipment and review their individual assignments. Haven remained behind, ostensibly to update communications logs, but actually hoping for an opportunity to share her concerns about the patrol route. She approached Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Steele as he studied the mission maps, her notebook containing detailed signal analysis tucked under her arm.
The problem had started on Haven's second week at Forward Operating Base Meridian, but it took months for her to fully understand the systematic nature of her exclusion. It began with small incidents that seemed insignificant individually, but formed a clear pattern when viewed together. During her first tactical briefing, she'd raised her hand to ask about radio backup procedures for the mission. Captain Reynolds had smiled condescendingly and said, "Don't worry about field procedures, Jackson. Your job is to keep the radios working back here where it's safe." The comments that followed were variations on the same theme. Too small for combat operations, too inexperienced for real missions, too valuable to risk in the field. Each justification sounded reasonable in isolation, but Haven began to recognize them as polite ways of saying she didn't belong with the real soldiers. The men who went on dangerous missions were tall, muscular, aggressive, everything she wasn't. Staff Sergeant Williams, her immediate supervisor, exemplified the attitude that kept her confined to base operations. A 15-year veteran with 3 combat deployments, Williams respected Haven's technical abilities but couldn't envision her in any role that required physical confrontation. "You're the best radio technician I've ever worked with," he told her during a performance review. "But combat isn't about technical skills. It's about strength, endurance, and the ability to carry a wounded soldier to safety. That's just not what you're built for." The frustration deepened during advanced training opportunities. When slots opened for forward observer training, the specialized course that taught soldiers to direct artillery fire, Haven submitted her application immediately. Her technical background made her a natural candidate, and she'd scored higher than anyone else on the prerequisite exams. The rejection came with a form letter, citing physical requirements and operational needs. But Haven knew the real reason. Forward observers worked in dangerous positions, often alone, calling down artillery strikes while under enemy fire. The command structure couldn't imagine someone like her surviving in such conditions. Similar rejections followed for combat medic training, advanced communications courses, and leadership development programs. Each opportunity that might have expanded her role beyond basic communication support was quietly denied. Haven watched as soldiers with lower test scores and less technical aptitude were selected for advanced training while she remained frozen in her original assignment. The isolation became more pronounced during off-duty hours. Combat soldiers formed tight bonds forged through shared danger and mutual dependence. They gathered in the recreation tent to swap stories about patrol missions, discussing tactics and terrain with the easy camaraderie of those who'd faced life-and-death situations together. Haven's presence in these conversations was tolerated but never welcomed. She was support staff, not a warrior. The divide was especially evident during equipment briefings. When new radio equipment arrived, Haven would spend hours learning its capabilities, reading technical manuals, and developing optimal operating procedures. She'd prepare detailed briefings about the equipment's potential applications and limitations, only to watch as mission planners ignored her insights in favor of their own assumptions. Her expertise was valued for maintenance and repair, but dismissed when it came to tactical applications. The breaking point came during a mission debriefing 6 months into her deployment. Alpha Company had encountered communication problems during a patrol that left them isolated for 3 hours without artillery support. The patrol leader criticized the radio equipment, claiming it was unreliable and poorly positioned. Haven had monitored the entire mission and knew exactly what had gone wrong. The patrol had moved through one of the dead zones she had identified, but no one had consulted her terrain analysis. After the briefing, she approached Captain Reynolds with her findings. She had prepared a comprehensive report showing how communication dead zones corresponded with terrain features and how simple route modifications could maintain constant radio contact. Reynolds glanced at her analysis for less than 30 seconds before handing it back. "Jackson, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but terrain analysis is handled by intelligence specialists with advanced training. Your job is to fix radios when they break, not to plan missions." The dismissal was delivered with a patronizing smile that made Haven's stomach churn. Intelligence specialists with advanced training. Specialists who'd overlooked the obvious correlation between terrain and radio coverage that she had documented in painstaking detail. Her months of careful analysis, her technical expertise, her growing understanding of tactical communications were all irrelevant because she didn't fit their image of a soldier who could contribute to mission planning. That night, Haven sat in her quarters reviewing rejection letters and performance evaluations that praised her technical skills while firmly establishing her limitations. Every document reinforced the same message. She was valuable in a support role, but unsuited for anything that mattered. The system had evaluated her based on physical appearance and preconceived notions rather than demonstrated capability. The morning briefing for Operation Thunderstrike followed the same predictable pattern that had defined Haven's 11 months at Forward Operating Base Meridian. Lieutenant Colonel Steele stood before a room of 40 soldiers, detailing a complex mission that would require precise coordination between ground forces and artillery support. Haven sat in the back row, notepad ready, knowing she'd be assigned communications monitoring duties while others received the dangerous, meaningful work. "This operation targets a confirmed enemy stronghold in the Kestrel Mountains," Steele announced, pointing to a detailed topographical map. "Intelligence indicates approximately 30 hostile fighters using the position to coordinate attacks on our supply convoys. Alpha and Bravo companies will establish blocking positions while Charlie Company conducts the primary assault." Haven studied the terrain features, immediately recognizing the communication challenges the mountainous region would present. As Steele continued outlining the operation, Haven's trained eye spotted several tactical problems. The proposed assault route passed through a narrow canyon that would funnel the attacking force into a potential kill zone. More critically, the planned artillery support positions were located in areas where radio signals would be severely degraded by the surrounding peaks. She'd spent months mapping these dead zones, understanding exactly where communication breakdowns would occur. The assignment phase began with Steele calling names for key positions. "Captain Morrison, you'll lead the assault element. Sergeant Rodriguez, you're handling close air support coordination. Corporal Thompson, you're our primary forward observer." Each name brought a small stab of frustration. Thompson had scored lower than Haven on artillery coordination exams, but his 6-foot frame and aggressive personality made him the obvious choice for dangerous forward positions. "Specialist Jackson, you'll monitor communications from the Tactical Operations Center. Make sure all radio frequencies remain clear and report any equipment malfunctions immediately." The familiar assignment felt like a prison sentence. While others prepared for combat operations that would test their skills and courage, she'd spend the mission listening to radio chatter from a reinforced bunker. After the briefing, Haven approached Corporal Thompson near the equipment depot. She'd worked with him during training exercises and knew his technical knowledge had significant gaps. "Thompson, I've been analyzing the terrain for this operation. The mountainous region creates serious communication dead zones that could isolate your forward observer position from artillery support." Thompson looked up from his gear with barely concealed annoyance. "Jackson, I appreciate the concern, but I've been doing this job for 2 years. I know how to maintain radio contact." Haven persisted, pulling out her carefully prepared terrain analysis. "The rock formations in Sectors 7 and 8 will block VHF signals completely. If you position yourself on the eastern ridge instead of the western approach, you'll maintain constant communication with fire support." Thompson glanced at her charts for less than 10 seconds before handing them back. "Look, I know you mean well, but forward observer work isn't about reading maps. It's about being in the field, under fire, making split-second decisions. That's just not something you can learn from a desk." The dismissal stung, but Haven had grown accustomed to having her expertise ignored. She watched Thompson return to his equipment preparation, knowing that his rejection of her analysis might cost lives during the operation. Her understanding of terrain and communication was superior to his, but his combat experience and physical presence gave him credibility she'd never possess. Similar conversations occurred throughout the preparation phase. When she approached Captain Morrison about potential ambush sites along the assault route, he thanked her politely before dismissing her concerns. When she offered updated frequency plans that would improve air support coordination, he assured her that standard procedures would be sufficient. Each interaction reinforced the same message. Her technical knowledge was useful for support functions but irrelevant for tactical decisions. The night before the operation, Haven sat in the communications bay reviewing mission frequencies and backup procedures. The Tactical Operations Center hummed with activity as officers finalized plans and equipment was distributed to assault teams. She could hear conversations drifting from the adjacent planning room, voices filled with excitement and nervous energy that came before dangerous missions. Thompson's solid, not the most technical guy, but he's got good instincts under pressure. The comment highlighted everything wrong with the military's evaluation system. Technical competence was dismissed as less important than undefined qualities like instincts and presence. Haven's months of studying terrain, memorizing procedures, and developing expertise counted for nothing against subjective impressions based on physical appearance and personality. Staff Sergeant Williams entered the communications bay, clipboard in hand, ready to review final equipment checks. "Jackson, I need you to run diagnostics on all radio equipment one more time. This operation is too important for communication failures." Haven nodded and began the familiar routine, testing each piece of equipment with methodical precision. Williams watched her work with obvious satisfaction. In his mind, she was performing exactly the role she was best suited for: technical support from a safe position. As Haven completed the diagnostics, she wondered how many operations had failed because decision-makers ignored technical expertise in favor of conventional thinking. Tomorrow's mission would likely succeed despite the tactical problems she'd identified, but the margin for error was smaller than anyone realized. She just hoped that when things went wrong, someone would remember that the communications specialist had tried to warn them.
While her fellow soldiers slept or relaxed during off-duty hours, Haven Jackson pursued a secret curriculum that would have surprised anyone who knew her only as the quiet communications specialist. Every evening after completing her assigned duties, she disappeared into the base's forgotten spaces to develop skills that no training manual required and no superior had requested. The abandoned storage building behind the motor pool had become her private training facility. Built decades earlier and now used only for surplus equipment, the concrete structure provided perfect acoustics for practicing artillery communication procedures. Haven had memorized every standard fire mission protocol, but she'd gone far beyond the basics. Using field manuals smuggled from the base library, she'd taught herself advanced targeting techniques, danger close procedures, and complex fire adjustment methods that even experienced forward observers rarely mastered. Her training setup was improvised but comprehensive. An old radio she'd repaired provided realistic static and interference conditions. Topographical maps covered every surface, marked with colored pins representing theoretical targets and friendly positions. She created scenario cards based on real combat situations, practicing split-second calculations under artificial time pressure. Night after night, she rehearsed calling in artillery strikes with precision that would have impressed professional fire support coordinators. The physical preparation was equally methodical. Haven had recognized early that her small stature would always be seen as a liability, so she'd focused on developing capabilities that didn't depend on raw strength. Her cardio conditioning was exceptional. She could run 15 miles without significant fatigue. More importantly, she developed unusual endurance for sustained mental activity under stress. While others trained their bodies for short bursts of intense action, Haven had conditioned herself for extended periods of focused concentration. Her tactical knowledge expanded through careful study of combat after-action reports.
The base's administrative office contained hundreds of mission debriefings from operations throughout the region. Haven spent hours reading these reports, analyzing what had gone right and wrong during actual combat operations. She noticed patterns that others missed: how communication failures led to friendly fire incidents, how poor positioning resulted in ineffective artillery support, how small tactical errors cascaded into mission failures. The terrain analysis project had grown into an obsession that consumed her free time. Using satellite imagery, elevation data, and signal propagation software she taught herself to operate, Haven had created the most detailed communication map of the operational area that existed anywhere. Her charts showed exactly where radio signals would be blocked, where backup frequencies would be needed, and how weather conditions affected communication reliability. The work was tedious and time-consuming, but Haven understood that information could be the difference between life and death. Combat medical training presented unique challenges since she couldn't access official courses, but Haven had found creative solutions. The base medical staff occasionally discarded expired training supplies that she quietly retrieved and used for self-instruction. She'd practiced treating gunshot wounds on mannequins, learned to start IVs using training arms, and memorized drug dosages for combat injuries. A sympathetic medic had unknowingly helped by leaving medical reference books where she could photograph relevant pages. The most ambitious part of her preparation involved studying artillery ballistics and targeting mathematics. Forward observers typically relied on pre-calculated firing solutions and standardized procedures, but Haven had taught herself the underlying principles. She could calculate firing angles, adjust for weather conditions, and determine optimal shell types for different targets. Her mathematical background from civilian education had provided the foundation, but months of dedicated study had built genuine expertise. Navigation skills presented another area where she could compensate for physical limitations through superior preparation. Haven had memorized terrain features throughout the operational area using military survey maps and aerial photographs. She could navigate by dead reckoning in complete darkness, identify locations using minimal visual references, and plot accurate coordinates under pressure. These abilities might prove crucial if she ever found herself in field conditions without electronic navigation aids. The weapons training was necessarily limited by equipment access, but Haven had maximized every opportunity. During routine maintenance periods, she'd familiarized herself with crew-served weapons that forward observers might need to operate. She'd studied ballistic characteristics of different ammunition types, learned employment techniques for various weapon systems, and practiced field stripping procedures until they became automatic. Her small hands actually provided advantages for detailed mechanical work that others overlooked. Perhaps most importantly, she developed exceptional situational awareness through deliberate practice. She trained herself to process multiple information streams simultaneously, monitoring radio communications while tracking friendly positions, while calculating firing solutions, while assessing threat conditions. This cognitive multitasking ability would prove essential in combat situations where split-second decisions determined outcomes. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become more qualified for forward observer duties than most soldiers officially assigned to those positions. Her preparation exceeded standard training requirements in every measurable area except physical size and institutional credibility. Haven knew that expertise without opportunity was ultimately meaningless, but she also understood that when opportunity finally presented itself, preparation would determine whether she succeeded or failed.
The emergency alert shattered the pre-dawn quiet of forward operating base Meridian at 0347 hours, its piercing tone sending soldiers scrambling from their bunks toward the Tactical Operations Center. Haven Jackson had been awake for 30 minutes, reviewing communication frequencies for the day's patrol schedules, when the crisis began unfolding through her radio headset. Static-filled transmissions painted a picture of disaster that made her blood run cold. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Eagle 7. came the desperate voice of Captain Morrison through heavy interference. "We are taking effective fire from multiple positions. Request immediate fire support." The transmission dissolved into static before anyone could respond, leaving the command center in controlled chaos as officers tried to piece together what had happened to their patrol units. Lieutenant Colonel Steele burst into the Tactical Operations Center, still pulling on his uniform jacket, his face grim as he absorbed the initial reports. The morning patrol had been routine reconnaissance until they'd walked into a carefully planned ambush in the Kestrel Mountains. 3 separate enemy positions were engaging Alpha Company with coordinated fire that had them pinned down in a valley with no cover and limited escape routes. "Get me a situation report," Steele barked at the duty officer. "How many casualties? What's their exact position?" The answers came in fragments through damaged radio communications. Alpha Company had 12 wounded soldiers, including Captain Morrison, who'd taken shrapnel to his chest and legs. Their radio equipment had been damaged in the initial attack, leaving them with sporadic communication capability at best. Haven listened to the deteriorating situation through her headset, her trained ear picking up details that others missed. The signal strength indicated that Alpha Company was trapped in one of the communication dead zones she had identified months earlier. Their radio transmissions were barely reaching the base, and more critically, they had no reliable way to coordinate artillery support that could suppress enemy positions and allow extraction. "Where's our forward observer?" Steele demanded, scanning the tactical display that showed friendly and enemy positions based on fragmentary reports. The duty officer checked his roster with a sinking expression. "Sir, Corporal Thompson was with Alpha Company. Latest reports indicate he's among the wounded and unable to perform his duties." The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Without a functioning forward observer, the trapped patrol couldn't call in accurate artillery fire to suppress enemy positions. The mountain terrain made close air support impossible in current weather conditions, and a rescue mission would likely result in additional casualties without fire support to cover the approach. Haven's mind raced through potential solutions as she listened to increasingly desperate transmissions from Alpha Company. The enemy had positioned themselves perfectly to exploit the terrain advantages, using overlapping fields of fire to pin down the patrol while remaining concealed from direct assault. Artillery support was the only viable option, but it required precise coordination that seemed impossible given the communication problems. "Sir, we're losing contact with Alpha Company. The radio is failing and atmospheric conditions are degrading signal quality." Even as he spoke, Morrison's voice faded in and out through heavy static, making coherent communication nearly impossible. Lieutenant Colonel Steele studied the tactical map with growing frustration. Colored pins showed the approximate positions of friendly and enemy forces, but the information was outdated and incomplete. Artillery units stood ready to provide fire support, but they needed accurate target coordinates and danger-close clearances that couldn't be reliably transmitted through the damaged communication links. "Options," Steele said simply, addressing the assembled officers. "I need alternatives for extracting Alpha Company before we lose them completely." The silence that followed spoke volumes about the limited choices available. A ground rescue would require moving additional forces through the same terrain where Alpha Company had been ambushed. Helicopter extraction was impossible without suppressing enemy air defenses. Artillery support remained the best option, but only if they could establish reliable communication with someone capable of directing accurate fire. Haven's heart hammered as she realized that she possessed the exact combination of skills needed to solve this crisis. Her months of studying terrain had given her intimate knowledge of the ambush site. Her self-taught artillery procedures exceeded the qualifications of most forward observers. Her communication expertise might allow her to establish contact where others had failed. But she also knew that suggesting her involvement would be dismissed immediately. The crisis was escalating with each passing minute. Enemy forces were likely moving to surround Alpha Company's position, turning a simple ambush into a potential massacre. Weather conditions were deteriorating, making helicopter operations even more dangerous. Most critically, Alpha Company's ammunition was running low, and their wounded needed immediate medical attention that couldn't be provided under continuous enemy fire. As chaos consumed the Tactical Operations Center, Haven Jackson sat at her communication station, experiencing a moment of crystalline clarity that cut through months of doubt and frustration. The radio crackled with Morrison's increasingly weak transmissions from Alpha Company's trapped position,
each broken message reinforcing what she already knew with absolute certainty. She was the only person who could save them. The recognition didn't come as a sudden revelation, but as the culmination of 11 months of preparation finally aligning with desperate necessity. Every hour she'd spent studying terrain maps, every night practicing artillery procedures, every calculation she'd memorized in that abandoned storage building had led to this moment. While officers around her debated impossible options and calculated unacceptable risks, Haven could see the solution with perfect clarity. She knew the exact terrain where Alpha Company was pinned down, Grid Square 347892 in the Kestrel Mountains, a narrow valley flanked by ridges that created both the ambush opportunity and the communication dead zone. She'd studied that location obsessively, understanding how the rock formations would block radio signals and create acoustic shadows that confused sound-based targeting. More importantly, she knew how to work around those limitations. The mathematical precision required to drop artillery shells within danger-close distances of friendly forces played to her greatest strengths. While others relied on pre-calculated firing tables and standardized procedures, Haven could perform ballistic calculations in her head, adjusting for wind speed, elevation differences, and charge variations in real time. She'd practiced these calculations thousands of times until they became as automatic as breathing. But technical knowledge alone wasn't enough. The mission would require her to move to a forward position where she could establish line-of-sight communication with both Alpha Company and the artillery units. That meant leaving the safety of the base, traveling through potentially hostile terrain, and potentially engaging enemy forces directly. Everything about the situation violated every assumption that others had made about her capabilities and limitations. Haven looked around the Tactical Operations Center at officers struggling with an impossible situation. Lieutenant Colonel Steele was examining maps with growing desperation, knowing that each passing minute reduced Alpha Company's chances of survival. The artillery commander stood ready to provide fire support, but needed target coordinates that couldn't be reliably transmitted through damaged communications. Everyone understood what needed to be done, but nobody could see how to do it. The internal debate that raged in Haven's mind lasted only seconds, but encompassed months of accumulated frustration and determination. She could follow protocol, remain at her assigned station, and watch Alpha Company die because the qualified personnel were either wounded or unable to reach the forward position. Or she could violate every regulation, ignore direct orders, and attempt something that everyone would consider impossible for someone like her. The choice crystallized around a simple truth. She'd spent 11 months being told she wasn't good enough, strong enough, or experienced enough to matter when lives were on the line. Today, 12 soldiers were dying in a mountain valley because the people deemed qualified couldn't perform the mission. She could perform the mission. The only question was whether she had the courage to prove it. Physical limitations that had defined others' perception of her suddenly seemed irrelevant. Her small size would actually be advantageous for moving through rough terrain without being detected. Her endurance conditioning would allow her to maintain performance under extended stress. Her communication expertise would enable her to coordinate complex fire missions while under pressure. Every supposed weakness could become a strength if she was willing to accept the risks. The bureaucratic consequences of acting independently seemed trivial compared to the alternative. Court-martial, discharge, and professional disgrace were possibilities she could live with. Watching Alpha Company die because she lacked the courage to use her abilities was not. The mathematical certainty of her tactical analysis overwhelmed any concerns about following proper procedures or respecting chain of command. Haven's hands moved to her equipment with steady determination, checking her radio, confirming her grid coordinates, and preparing for movement. The plan forming in her mind was audacious, but tactically sound. She would move to the northern ridge overlooking Alpha Company's position, establish communication with both the trapped patrol and artillery units, and direct precision fire missions that would suppress enemy positions long enough for extraction.
The mission would require her to perform under combat conditions that would challenge experienced soldiers. She'd need to calculate firing solutions while under potential enemy fire, maintain multiple radio communications simultaneously, and coordinate complex timing between artillery strikes and ground movement. Success would depend on every skill she'd developed during months of secret preparation.
Haven Jackson approached Lieutenant Colonel Steele with her field equipment already secured to her tactical vest, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The Tactical Operations Center buzzed with frantic activity as officers continued searching for solutions to an increasingly desperate situation. Alpha Company's radio transmissions had become sporadic whispers, punctuated by the distant sound of gunfire that emphasized their deteriorating circumstances. "Sir," Haven said, stepping into Steele's line of sight as he studied the tactical map with growing frustration. "I can reach Alpha Company's position and provide forward observer support." The statement hung in the air like an unexploded shell, drawing stares from every officer within hearing distance. Steele looked up from his maps with an expression that cycled rapidly through confusion, disbelief, and barely controlled anger. "Jackson, what did you just say?" Steele's voice carried the dangerous quiet that preceded explosive outbursts. Haven maintained eye contact, her shoulders squared despite knowing that her next words would likely end her military career. "Sir, I've studied the terrain extensively. I know exactly where Alpha Company is trapped, and I can establish communication from the northern ridge. I'm qualified to direct artillery support for their extraction." The silence that followed was deafening. Major Phillips, the operations officer, was the first to find his voice. "Jackson, you're a communications specialist. You're not trained for forward observer duties, and you're certainly not qualified for solo missions in hostile territory." Haven had anticipated this objection and pulled out her carefully prepared documentation. "Sir, I've completed advanced artillery coordination training through correspondence courses. My test scores exceed requirements for forward observer certification." Steele examined her unofficial transcripts with visible skepticism. The courses were legitimate, but they'd been completed independently without official authorization or recognition. More problematically, passing written examinations was vastly different from performing under combat conditions. "These courses don't qualify you for field operations, Jackson. Paper tests don't prepare you for directing danger close fire missions while under enemy fire." "With respect, sir, I've also completed extensive terrain analysis of the operational area. I know that Alpha Company is trapped in grid square 347892, approximately 800 meters from the northern ridge, where I can establish line-of-sight communication with both friendly forces and artillery units." The specific coordinates caught Steele's attention, but his expression remained skeptical. Captain Rodriguez, the artillery liaison officer, stepped forward with obvious concern. "Even if you could reach that position, Jackson, directing artillery fire requires split-second decision-making under extreme stress. One miscalculation could result in friendly fire casualties." Haven had practiced this exact scenario hundreds of times in her secret training sessions, but she couldn't reveal that preparation without exposing her unauthorized activities. "Sir, I understand the risks, but Alpha Company will die without artillery support. Their current position offers no escape routes, and enemy forces are likely moving to surround them. Every minute we delay reduces their chances of survival." The mathematical certainty in her voice surprised several officers, but it also highlighted the fundamental problem with her proposal. Lieutenant Colonel Steele closed her correspondence course transcripts and handed them back with finality. "Jackson, I appreciate your initiative, but this mission requires a qualified soldier with combat experience. You're a support specialist, not a forward observer. The physical demands alone would be beyond your capabilities." The familiar dismissal based on her size and appearance struck like a physical blow. "Sir, the mission requires someone who can navigate difficult terrain, establish reliable communications, and perform accurate targeting calculations under pressure. I can do all of those things." Haven's voice remained steady, but she could feel her opportunity slipping away as officers exchanged skeptical glances that reinforced their collective dismissal of her capabilities. Major Phillips consulted his personnel roster with obvious frustration.
We're working on alternatives, Jackson. Sergeant Williams has forward observer experience from his previous deployment. We're preparing him to attempt the mission. Haven knew Williams personally, a competent soldier whose artillery knowledge was limited to basic fire support procedures. He lacked the mathematical background for complex targeting calculations and had never studied the specific terrain where Alpha Company was trapped. "Sir, Sergeant Williams doesn't know the terrain," Haven said desperately. "The communication dead zones, the elevation changes, the optimal firing positions, I've mapped all of it. I've spent months preparing for exactly this type of situation." Her words carried conviction born from extensive preparation, but they also revealed knowledge that raised uncomfortable questions about her activities during off-duty hours. "How exactly did you acquire this terrain knowledge, Jackson?" Steele's question carried implications that Haven couldn't address without admitting to unauthorized reconnaissance activities. Her careful preparation had become evidence of inappropriate initiative that exceeded her assigned responsibilities. The conversation was interrupted by another weak transmission from Alpha Company. Morrison's voice came through heavy static, reporting 2 additional casualties and dwindling ammunition supplies. The sound of continuous gunfire in the background emphasized the urgency of their situation and the limited time available for rescue operations. Lieutenant Colonel Steele made his decision, with the authority of command and the weight of responsibility. "Jackson, return to your communication station and maintain radio contact with all units. Sergeant Williams will attempt to reach the forward position within the hour. That's final." The dismissal was absolute, delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance and no further discussion. Haven stood at attention and acknowledged the order, but her mind was already moving beyond official channels toward the unauthorized action that military protocol would never sanction.
Haven Jackson waited until Sergeant Williams departed the Tactical Operations Center with his hastily assembled gear before making the decision that would irrevocably change her military career. The Central Command area buzzed with controlled chaos as officers coordinated multiple contingency plans, none of which addressed the fundamental problem. Williams lacked the terrain knowledge and mathematical precision required to direct effective artillery support for Alpha Company's extraction. She slipped out of the Tactical Operations Center through the rear entrance, her field equipment already secured and her route carefully planned. The early morning hours provided natural concealment, as most base personnel focused on the developing crisis rather than routine security protocols. Haven had studied guard rotations and patrol patterns during her months of preparation, understanding exactly when and where she could move undetected. The equipment storage area behind the communications building offered temporary concealment while she conducted final preparations. Haven checked her radio equipment, confirmed her math coordinates, and reviewed the artillery firing data she'd calculated during the endless hours of secret training. Every piece of gear had been selected for specific purposes that reflected months of careful planning for exactly this type of unauthorized mission. Her route to the northern ridge required crossing 8 kilometers of rough terrain that included 2 checkpoint positions manned by base security. Haven had identified an alternative path that utilized maintenance roads and natural concealment features to bypass official monitoring points. The journey would take approximately 90 minutes if she maintained the pace she'd practiced during countless night training runs. The first kilometer passed without incident as Haven moved through familiar territory near the base perimeter. Her small size proved advantageous for navigating through dense vegetation and rocky outcroppings that would challenge larger soldiers. The physical conditioning she'd developed through months of secretive training allowed her to maintain speed while carrying the additional equipment required for independent operations. Radio communications from the Tactical Operations Center provided constant updates on Alpha Company's deteriorating situation. Morrison's transmissions had become increasingly weak and sporadic, indicating that their radio equipment was failing just as enemy pressure continued to intensify. Time was running out faster than anyone had anticipated, and conventional rescue operations were proving inadequate for the tactical realities of the situation. The second checkpoint represented the greatest risk to Haven's unauthorized departure from base security zones. Two guards monitored the access road that led toward the operational area, their position offering clear observation of approaches from multiple directions. Haven waited in concealment for 20 minutes, timing their patrol pattern and identifying a window when both guards would be occupied with routine communications checks. She moved during the brief interval when guard attention was focused elsewhere, using natural terrain features to mask her movement across the open ground near the checkpoint. The technique she'd practiced repeatedly during training exercises proved effective under real conditions, allowing her to bypass security measures without detection. Each successful obstacle reinforced her confidence in the preparation that others had dismissed as inappropriate initiative. The terrain became increasingly challenging as Haven approached the operational area where Alpha Company was trapped. Rocky ridges and steep valleys required technical climbing skills that exceeded standard military training requirements. Her civilian rock climbing background, combined with the specialized equipment she'd quietly acquired, enabled her to navigate obstacles that would stop most soldiers. Halfway to her destination, Haven encountered the first signs of enemy activity. Fresh tire tracks in sandy soil indicated recent vehicle movement along routes that intelligence reports had designated as clear. She adjusted her approach to avoid potential observation while maintaining progress toward the ridge position that would provide line-of-sight communication with both Alpha Company and artillery support units. The radio chatter from the Tactical Operations Center grew increasingly urgent as Sergeant Williams reported his own difficulties reaching the forward position. His unfamiliarity with the terrain was causing significant delays, and his radio communications suggested confusion about optimal routes and safe approaches. Haven's fears about his inadequate preparation were proving accurate as precious time slipped away. At 0630 hours, exactly 3 hours after the initial emergency alert, Haven reached the rocky outcropping that would serve as her forward observer position. The location provided clear observation of the valley where Alpha Company was pinned down, while offering concealment from enemy positions on the surrounding ridges. Her months of terrain study had identified this exact position as optimal for directing artillery support operations. She established her equipment with methodical precision, testing radio communications with both friendly units and artillery positions. The clarity of transmissions from her carefully selected location demonstrated the value of thorough reconnaissance and technical preparation. Unlike the communication problems that plagued operations from standard positions, Haven could maintain clear contact with all necessary elements. As she prepared to announce her unauthorized presence and begin directing fire missions, Haven understood that she'd crossed multiple lines that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd violated direct orders, abandoned her assigned position, and undertaken an independent mission that exceeded her official authority. Military justice would inevitably follow, but Alpha Company's survival depended on capabilities that only she possessed. The mathematical precision required for danger-close artillery strikes played to her greatest strengths, while her intimate knowledge of the terrain provided tactical advantages that no one else could match. Success would prove that preparation and determination mattered more than physical appearance or institutional approval. Failure would likely result in multiple casualties and her own court-martial. Haven keyed her radio and prepared to announce her presence to a command structure that had never imagined she was capable of the mission she was about to perform.
Watchdog Base, this is Spotter 7. Haven Jackson's voice cut through the static-filled chaos of military radio traffic at 0642 hours. The call sign was improvised, chosen to identify her position without immediately revealing her unauthorized presence to the Tactical Operations Center. Her radio transmitted with crystal clarity from the northern ridge, a stark contrast to the garbled communications that had plagued the rescue operation for the past 3 hours. The response came immediately from Alpha Company's trapped position. Spotter 7, this is Eagle Leader. Morrison's voice crackled through heavy interference. We are taking effective fire from 3 positions, ammunition critical. Multiple casualties require immediate extraction. Haven could hear the desperation underlying his professional military bearing, the controlled panic of a leader watching his soldiers die while helpless to change their circumstances. Haven activated her targeting scope and began the precise work she'd practiced thousands of times in secret training sessions. The enemy positions were exactly where her terrain analysis had predicted they would be, along the eastern ridge, where overlapping fields of fire created an inescapable kill zone. Her mathematical calculations confirmed optimal firing solutions that would suppress hostile positions while maintaining safe distances from friendly forces. Battery control, this is Spotter 7. Fire mission. Grid 347-892, 3 enemy positions engaging friendly forces, danger close. Requesting high explosive rounds, proximity fuse, minimal charge. The artillery response came with professional skepticism that Haven had anticipated. Her improvised call sign and unfamiliar voice raised questions about her authority and qualifications. Spotter 7, identify yourself and confirm authorization for danger close mission. The artillery commander's demand for credentials represented exactly the bureaucratic obstacle that Haven had known would challenge her unauthorized operation. She responded with the technical precision that would establish her competence regardless of official status. Battery control, firing data as follows. Direction 284.7 mils, elevation 312 mils, charge 2, proximity fuse setting 7.3 seconds. Friendly forces marked by smoke, danger close authorization, acknowledged. The mathematical accuracy of her calculations impressed the artillery crew and convinced them to proceed despite questions about her authority. The first rounds impacted with devastating precision, exactly 30 meters from Alpha Company's position. Enemy fire from the eastern ridge ceased immediately as hostile soldiers sought cover from the perfectly placed artillery strikes. Haven adjusted fire rapidly, walking successive rounds across enemy positions with a mathematical precision that demonstrated months of careful preparation. Excellent hit, Spotter 7. Morson's voice carried renewed hope as oppressive enemy fire slackened for the first time in hours. We're preparing to move wounded to extraction point. Haven monitored multiple radio frequencies while calculating firing solutions for additional missions, her cognitive multitasking abilities proving essential for coordinating complex operations. The second enemy position required more delicate handling due to its proximity to a civilian structure that intelligence reports indicated might contain non-combatants. Haven calculated a firing solution that would neutralize the military threat while minimizing collateral damage, demonstrating the precision that separated expert forward observers from merely competent ones. But as she prepared to call in the second fire mission, muzzle flashes from the southern ridge revealed her own position to enemy forces. Bullets began striking the rocks around her concealed position, forcing her to continue directing artillery strikes while under direct fire. The scenario she'd practiced in imagination became terrifyingly real as hostile rounds cracked past her position with increasing accuracy. Haven pressed herself against the rocky cover while maintaining radio communications and targeting calculations. Her small size provided advantages for finding concealment, but it also meant that any hit would likely prove fatal. Blood from rock fragments cut her hands and face, but her voice remained steady as she continued coordinating fire support for Alpha Company's extraction. Battery control, adjust fire 200 meters south. Enemy position engaging spotter location. Request immediate suppression. The professional calm in her voice belied the terror she felt as automatic weapons fire intensified around her position. Training took over as conscious thought became impossible under the overwhelming stress of combat conditions.
The decisive moment came at 07:34 hours when Haven Jackson spotted the movement that would change everything. Through her targeting scope, she observed enemy reinforcements approaching Alpha Company's position from the Western Valley, approximately 40 hostile fighters moving to encircle the trap patrol and eliminate any possibility of escape. The conventional rescue operation would arrive too late to prevent a massacre. Eagle Leader, be advised you have approximately 40 enemy personnel moving to surround your position from the west, Haven transmitted while calculating firing solutions for the most complex artillery mission of her career. I can stop them, but it requires danger-close fire with minimal margin for error. Morrison's response carried the weight of desperate mathematics. 12 wounded soldiers against overwhelming enemy forces with no alternative options remaining. Spotter 7, we're out of ammunition and time. Do whatever you can. The authorization was unofficial but absolute, carrying the moral authority of soldiers who understood that unconventional solutions were their only hope for survival. Haven began the most demanding calculations she'd ever attempted, determining firing patterns that would destroy enemy forces while preserving friendly lives separated by mere meters. The mathematical precision required exceeded standard military procedures and demanded the advanced techniques she taught herself during months of secret preparation. Wind speeds varied across the valley due to terrain effects, requiring individual adjustments for each artillery round. Elevation differences created ballistic complications that most forward observers couldn't calculate under optimal conditions, much less while under direct enemy fire. Haven's hands moved across her equipment with practiced efficiency as hostile bullets continued striking her position with increasing frequency. Blood from multiple fragment wounds made her grip slippery, but her mathematical training allowed her to maintain accuracy despite physical trauma and psychological stress. Each calculation had to be perfect. Any error would result in friendly casualties that would haunt her forever. Battery control, fire mission. Grid 348-891. Multiple enemy squads in the open. Mixed high explosive and white phosphorus. Adjustments as follows. Haven transmitted a complex series of calculations that impressed even experienced artillery crews with their sophistication and precision. Her ability to process multiple variables simultaneously while under fire demonstrated capabilities that exceeded most professional forward observers. The artillery strikes began impacting with devastating accuracy, catching enemy reinforcements in the open terrain where they had no protection from precisely directed firepower. Haven adjusted each successive round with mathematical precision, walking destruction across enemy formations while maintaining perfect safety margins for Alpha Company's position. The technical excellence of her fire direction saved dozens of friendly lives through pure competence. But the enemy response was immediate and overwhelming. Recognizing that their assault was being decimated by accurate artillery fire, hostile forces concentrated their remaining firepower on Haven's position. Automatic weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and sniper fire converged on the northern ridge, where she continued directing fire missions despite increasing personal danger. The first bullet struck Haven in her left shoulder at 0741 hours, spinning her against the rocky cover with tremendous force. The impact felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, but her radio training kept her focused on mission requirements rather than personal injury. She keyed her microphone with her right hand while blood soaked through her uniform from the shoulder wound. Battery control. Continue firing. Grid 348-892. Adjust fire 50 meters north. Her voice remained steady despite the shock and pain that threatened to overwhelm her concentration. The artillery rounds continued impacting with perfect accuracy, systematically destroying enemy positions that had seemed invincible just minutes earlier. The second bullet caught her in the right thigh, shattering bone and dropping her to the ground behind her rocky shelter. Haven dragged herself to her radio equipment, her left arm useless and her right leg unable to support her weight. Blood loss was becoming critical, but Alpha Company's extraction still required precise fire support to succeed. 3 more bullets found their mark over the following minutes as Haven continued directing artillery strikes from her increasingly precarious position. Each impact drove her closer to unconsciousness, but her mathematical training remained sharp even as her physical condition deteriorated. She calculated firing solutions with mechanical precision while her life slowly drained away. Eagle Leader, extraction route is clear. Move now to grid 347-889. Artillery will provide covering fire during movement. Haven's transmission was weaker now, her voice strained by blood loss and shock, but her targeting remained flawless. Alpha Company began their movement towards safety under the protective umbrella of perfectly directed artillery fire. As the trap patrol reached safety and helicopter extraction became possible, Haven Jackson had accomplished something unprecedented in military history. Shot 5 times and losing blood rapidly, she had directed artillery strikes for over 4 hours with mathematical precision that saved 12 soldiers who would otherwise have died in an isolated mountain valley. Her unauthorized mission had violated regulations, ignored direct orders, and exceeded her official authority in every possible way. It had also demonstrated that technical competence, careful preparation, and absolute determination could overcome institutional limitations and save lives when conventional approaches failed completely. The bullets had stopped her body, but nothing could stop the artillery strikes she continued directing with perfect accuracy until Alpha Company reached safety.
The rescue helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as Haven Jackson slipped in and out of consciousness, her radio still clutched in her blood-soaked hands despite losing massive amounts of blood from 5 separate gunshot wounds. The medical team that rappelled down to her position found her maintaining artillery communications even as her vital signs crashed, directing covering fire for Alpha Company's final extraction with mathematical precision that defied medical logic. Patient has multiple GSWs, severe blood loss, but she's still coordinating fire missions, Sergeant Martinez, the lead medic, reported to the helicopter crew as he worked to stabilize Haven's injuries. Her shoulder wound had shattered her collarbone, the thigh injury had fractured her femur, and 3 additional bullets had caused tissue damage that would normally incapacitate any soldier. Yet she continued transmitting targeting coordinates with unwavering accuracy. Lieutenant Colonel Steele's voice crackled through the radio as the medical evacuation proceeded. "Spotter 7, identify yourself immediately. Who authorized your position and fire missions?" Haven's response came in a whisper that barely registered through her damaged radio equipment. "Communications Specialist Haven Jackson, serial number 847-923-661. Alpha Company required immediate fire support." The silence that followed her identification was profound. Every officer monitoring the radio frequency realized simultaneously that their most successful artillery operation in months had been conducted by the communication specialist they'd dismissed as unsuitable for field operations. The mathematical precision of her fire direction had saved 12 soldiers while she slowly died from wounds that would have stopped most combat veterans immediately. Captain Morrison's voice cut through the stunned silence from Alpha Company's extraction point. "Spotter 7, Jackson, you saved our lives, every single one of us. We're all coming home because of what you did up there." His transmission carried emotion that violated military communication protocols but perfectly captured the debt that Alpha Company owed to the woman who'd sacrificed everything to reach them. As Haven was loaded into the medical helicopter, her condition deteriorated rapidly despite the medics' efforts to control bleeding and stabilize her vital signs. She'd lost nearly half her blood volume and was showing signs of hypovolemic shock that threatened organ failure. The flight surgeon worked frantically to maintain her blood pressure while the aircraft raced toward the base medical facility. "Stay with us, Jackson," Sergeant Martinez urged as Haven's consciousness faded. "You've got to see this through. Alpha Company is safe because of you, but we need you to survive this." Her response was barely audible above the helicopter noise, but the determination in her voice remained unbroken despite her physical condition. The Tactical Operations Center had descended into controlled chaos as officers struggled to process what had occurred. The communication specialist they'd relegated to equipment maintenance had conducted the most successful artillery operation in the unit's history while dying from multiple gunshot wounds. Her technical expertise had exceeded that of experienced forward observers, and her courage under fire had surpassed anything in their collective experience. Major Phillips reviewed the artillery fire records with growing amazement. "These calculations are perfect. Every single adjustment, every firing solution, the mathematical precision is extraordinary. She was directing danger-close missions with an accuracy that most artillery specialists couldn't achieve under optimal conditions, let alone while bleeding to death." The medical team at Forward Operating Base Meridian had been alerted to prepare for a critical trauma case, but nothing had prepared them for Haven's condition when the helicopter arrived. Dr. Sarah Chen, the base surgeon, immediately recognized that conventional trauma protocols would be insufficient for the multiple life-threatening injuries that Haven had sustained during her 4-hour artillery mission. "Get her to surgery immediately," Dr. Chen ordered as the medical team transferred Haven from the helicopter. "Type and cross-match for 10 units of blood. Prep the OR for multiple surgical procedures." As they wheeled her toward the medical facility, Haven's hand still gripped her radio with determination that amazed everyone who witnessed her condition. The base personnel who gathered outside the medical facility represented every unit and specialty at Forward Operating Base Meridian. Word of Haven's unauthorized mission and subsequent heroism had spread rapidly, creating a mixture of admiration and disbelief that challenged every assumption about courage, competence, and dedication. The communication specialist who'd been invisible for 11 months had become the most respected soldier on the base. Lieutenant Colonel Steele stood outside the medical facility, his expression cycling through confusion, anger, and grudging admiration as he processed the implications of Haven's actions. She'd violated direct orders, exceeded her authority, and conducted an unauthorized mission that saved 12 lives through technical excellence that exceeded his unit's capabilities. Military justice would eventually address her violations, but immediate concerns focused on whether she would survive her injuries. Inside the surgical suite, Dr. Chen worked to repair damage that would have killed most soldiers hours earlier. Haven's determination to continue directing artillery strikes while dying had demonstrated a level of dedication that challenged medical understanding of human endurance and willpower. Her survival would depend on the same refusal to quit that characterized her entire unauthorized mission. As news of her condition spread beyond the base, Haven Jackson had become something unprecedented, a communications specialist whose technical expertise and personal courage had redefined what was possible for soldiers who refused to accept limitations imposed by others' expectations.
6 weeks after her unauthorized artillery mission, Haven Jackson stood at attention in the base's main assembly hall, her left arm still in a sling and her right leg supported by a walking brace. The ceremony that was about to unfold represented the most unusual recognition in Forward Operating Base Meridian's history, the commendation of a soldier who had violated multiple regulations while achieving extraordinary results that saved 12 lives. Colonel Marcus Webb, the regional commander who had flown in specifically for this ceremony, addressed the assembled personnel with words that would reshape military thinking about capability and opportunity. Today, we recognize actions that challenge conventional understanding of courage, competence, and dedication. Specialist Jackson's unauthorized mission violated established protocols while demonstrating the highest ideals of military service. The Bronze Star Medal with Valor device represented unprecedented recognition for a communication specialist whose technical expertise had exceeded that of trained combat specialists. But more significant than the decoration was the announcement that followed. Effective immediately, Specialist Jackson is transferred to the 15th Artillery Regiment as a forward observer, with accelerated promotion to sergeant pending completion of advanced certification requirements. The transformation was complete. The communication specialist who had been deemed too small, too inexperienced, and too limited for field operations was now recognized as possessing capabilities that exceeded traditional training and experience. Her months of secret preparation had been validated through performance under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel Steele, who had initially dismissed her offers of assistance, stepped forward to read the official citation. For extraordinary heroism in action against hostile forces while serving as an impromptu forward observer. Despite sustaining multiple gunshot wounds, Sergeant Jackson directed artillery fire with mathematical precision that enabled the successful extraction of surrounded friendly forces. Her technical expertise and personal courage under fire reflect the highest traditions of military service. The assembled soldiers included Alpha Company members who owed their lives to Haven's expertise and determination. Captain Morrison, now fully recovered from his own injuries, spoke for his unit with words that captured the debt they would never forget. Sergeant Jackson proved that courage isn't measured by physical size or official qualifications. She saved every one of us through competence, preparation, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. The ripple effects of Haven's actions extended far beyond individual recognition. Her case had prompted comprehensive review of personnel assignment policies, training requirements, and the utilization of specialized skills throughout the military structure. Soldiers who had been confined to narrow roles based on physical appearance or conventional assumptions were receiving opportunities to demonstrate broader capabilities. Major Phillips announced the establishment of new training programs that would identify and develop exceptional technical abilities regardless of soldiers' assigned specialties. Sergeant Jackson's example demonstrates that preparation and expertise can emerge from unexpected sources. We're implementing procedures to recognize and utilize hidden capabilities that might prove crucial during crisis situations. The base's communications section had been transformed by Haven's example. Soldiers who had previously accepted limited roles were pursuing advanced training in artillery science, tactical operations, and field procedures. Her demonstration that technical specialists could excel in combat roles had inspired others to exceed traditional boundaries between support and operational functions. Dr. Chen provided the medical perspective that added another dimension to Haven's extraordinary story. Sergeant Jackson's ability to maintain cognitive function while sustaining life-threatening injuries challenges medical understanding of human performance under extreme stress. Her case will be studied for years as an example of determination overcoming physiological limitations. As the ceremony concluded, Haven reflected on the journey from invisible communication specialist to recognized combat leader. 11 months of secret preparation had culminated in 4 hours of combat that proved capabilities that others couldn't imagine. But more importantly, her actions had demonstrated that institutional limitations often reflected assumptions rather than reality. The soldiers filing out of the assembly hall carried a different understanding of potential and possibility. Haven's example had shown that preparation without guaranteed opportunity was still valuable, that technical expertise could prove more important than physical strength, and that individuals willing to exceed assigned limitations could achieve extraordinary results. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had initially attempted the rescue mission that Haven completed, approached her with words that captured the transformed understanding her actions had created. "Jackson, Sergeant Jackson, you've changed how this entire base thinks about capability and courage. You proved that being ready for opportunity is the only way to create it." Her response was characteristically direct and modest. "I just prepared for situations that might arise and used those skills when they were needed. Every soldier should be ready to exceed their assigned role when circumstances require it." Her words reflected the same mathematical certainty that had characterized her artillery direction, treating extraordinary achievement as the logical result of adequate preparation. The communication specialist, who had been too small to matter, had become the soldier who mattered most when lives depended on refusing to accept limitations. Her story would inspire others to prepare beyond requirements, to develop capabilities beyond assignments, and to prove that impossible was just another word for unprepared. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.